Okay, good evening, gentlemen. We're lucky to have Chris Fitzgerald this evening to talk to us about Hovercraft training and their experience at Neoteric. So I'll hand directly over to Chris and stop my sharing so that he can share his screen.
Thank you, Alan, and good evening and good morning to the audience. Thank you for attending. We conduct the training at Neoteric usually takes about 11 hours. So I'm faced with the difficulty of compressing that 11 hours into 45 minutes. So I'm going to have to skip a lot of what I regard as very useful material. The course itself is broken up in, well, there's two groups, Neoteric, and I have also another company called Hovercrafttraining.com that is involved in doing the training. We have a manual which goes off to the prospective students, and it's about 128 pages. Very few students actually bother to read it, and it's very obvious when they come to the class. Those that are prepared are usually able to participate a lot better. We try to get people to study the manual, but few actually do. At the end of the course, we give a certificate. We have various levels of training. This is called the basic training, which is what I'm covering right now. I'm going to try and take you through an abbreviated version of the training. And most hovercraft, from my experience, whether they're small or large, have very similar characteristics. So you can learn a lot from operating small hovercraft, probably a better approach than trying to learn with big hovercraft, which are a lot more expensive to operate. And then there are a couple of lessons that I'd like to start off with. One is these two lessons. If you learn these, if you learn nothing else, these two lessons are probably the most valuable. The propeller and the fan is a powerful vacuum cleaner, and everything that's in the hovercraft has to be in some way stored or strapped down. So shotgun shells and makeup cases and hats and all of these things will get drawn into the fan. So we have a lot of issues with students damaging the fans almost straight away after they get their machine. And the second thing is, in the hands of a student or a novice, hovercraft are magnetically attracted to all obstacles. And the lesson to learn from that is that you must pick a training area which is void of any obstacles, a large open area. Those two lessons are extremely important. If you would like to ask any questions during the course, feel free. The agenda that we follow, we have a photo session to start off of the student receiving their certificate, because sometimes at the end of the day, there isn't anyone at the factory to take a photo. We explain what's going to happen when they get to the river, which is nearby. We then depart for the river. We then demonstrate the trailering systems we use, because there are a couple of different types. And then we spend 2.5 to 3 hours on the water covering all of the basic things that are needed to be learned. We return to the factory, clean the craft, and check the spark plugs, as that's a way of determining how the engine's performing. We have lunch. We do a factory tour. We do then a detailed study of the craft that we were training on, covering lift system, thrust system, controls, instrumentation, and maintenance. Then we have a classroom session, which lasts for a couple of hours, and it gives them a chance to get some sleep. But during that time, we cover the lift, thrust, controls, and hump plus turning, side slipping and ditching. Those things are covered in detail. And then we have a comprehensive test, which the instructor also participates in, because sometimes it's a way of picking up things that have been missed in the class. And then we have a course review, which the student is asked to fill in, and that sometimes provides some pretty useful information. So in 45 minutes, I plan to take you through expose you to what's involved in learning to fly and maintain a hovercraft. First, why were hovercraft invented? Well, going way back, civilization grew up along rivers, and we engaged in trucking and bartering after we have all our basic requirements met. And the trucking is moving goods from one place to another. And the most efficient way to do that is by water, although today it's actually pipeline. But water is still number two. And if you can travel over the water faster than somebody else, you get an economic advantage because you can move more goods from one place to another. The issue with all displacement vessels, is there's only one way to increase their speed, and that is to lift them out of the water. So all these vehicles you see, like catamarans, hydrofoils, ram wings, planing craft, they're all doing one thing. They're all lifting the hull out of the water. And the hovercraft is just another way of doing the same thing. So it was invented as a way to reduce the resistance and go faster. However, the hovercraft being the only amphibious child of the air cushion vehicle family, what this means is it can do things that nothing else can do quite as well, such as operating in thin ice, fast flowing water and mud. So its significance has become more important in doing these tasks, which often result in rescue type duties and surveying and so on, rather than going fast. So how they work is a very simple system. You just have an area and you put air underneath, and you can put the air in any direction or any position you want, and the craft will hover. And you can put a couple of coins in the middle of a piece of paper and you can see that it'll lift them. And if you move the coins around, you'll see that it will control the piece of paper. I actually had all this on a video, but we're having some issue bringing it up onto the screen. So I'm improvising at the moment. So hovercraft are more like helicopters than they are boats. And that's why I'm wearing a flight suit, because I like to impress on the student that this is more than a boat, it's like flying. So you have to think about hovercraft as like a flying machine. So we also try and encourage the student to start a logbook in the same way that aircraft have logbooks. Now, when you're selling a hovercraft, you're selling a three-legged stool. Each leg has the same value. One leg is the hovercraft. The other leg is piloting or operating protocol. And the third leg is maintenance. If you leave one of those legs out, you have a two-legged stool. So if you can imagine, the real way of marketing hovercraft is the same way you sell an aircraft. People normally don't buy an aircraft without training. So I see that as the way of the future for marketing hovercraft, is really to train people and get them to understand about maintenance and when and where and how to operate the craft. There's one thing that I've learned in my years of experience here, is that good judgment comes from experience, and experience comes from poor judgment. And I see this every day in the students that leave here. You see what happens. And training, of course, is one way to alleviate a lot of the poor judgment decisions. We also urge the student to have a maximum speed of 25 miles per hour, because under that speed, you don't really get into much trouble if the craft stops suddenly. And you need a GPS in order to measure that speed. You should not carry any passengers for the first 5 hours because a passenger can control the hovercraft. And side-by-side seating is the best for training because the instructor can grab the controls and can see the instruments. Whereas inline seating is more difficult because the instructor is behind the student. And of course, clothing is important. The very best clothing for hovercraft is your birthday suit. There isn't any clothing that works properly in hovercraft. There's nothing that's been developed that's really suitable. So you always end up with getting sand in your eyes and rocks in your boots. And it's very hard to find something that works well in operating a hovercraft. Of course, if you're in a cabin, it's a different story. Now, the river where we do the training, we've now got a photo showing this is one of the hover-on, hover-off trailers. So the craft is being delivered to the river. And this is just showing how it's unloaded. And then you can see in the background that we have the river. That's where we're going to do the training. And this is 5 miles from the factory. We can go back a little bit to explain that how a hovercraft works. Can you show that one?
The same video?
Show that one.
This one?
Yeah. So this is just a piece of paper which represents a hovercraft. And I use this to explain the concept. And you can blow air underneath from any direction. So if you...
It's 1 to 2 for a hovercraft. This is the center of gravity, also the center of pressure, center of cushion. And so when the hovercraft's hovering, it's sitting on this center of pressure like this, balanced there, and this is the center of gravity. And if you move the CG forward, you change the trim. If you move it back, put the nose up, move it forward, put the nose down. So if this is considered an area under which we put some air, is hovering. So if we put some payload, a couple of coins on there, it'll carry the payload. If we move the payload around, this is called weight balance. And you can see that that will control the hovercraft. So weight balance is extremely critical. I might say that when you put the air in, it doesn't matter where you put the air. You can put it in the middle or on the side at the front. Put the air in, and then it lifts. And if you can make a seal around the edge, which we call a skirt, then you can limit the amount of air escaping. And if you have a perfect seal, once you lift it up, you don't have to put any more air underneath. But because it's running over various terrain, which is not flat, and air is escaping around the bottom, the seal is touching the surface, and that's where the seal wears out. And there are lots of different types of seals, and each one of them has its own properties, and you can combine seals, one design with another, to get the characteristics of each one and put them together and gain advantage from that. So the skirts rub on the ground or the surface and they wear out. And when you're running over sand, that's what you make sandpaper out of. So therefore it scuffs off the bottom of the skirts and they get worn off and have to be replaced every now and then. If you have a big daylight clearance underneath where the air is escaping between the skirt and the ground, a little air gap there, that lubricates the bottom of the skirt and will make them last a lot longer. But the cost of that is that you have to have a lot more energy going into the lift system, which makes more noise, uses more fuel, and produces more dust and spray.
All right, we'll continue with it. Skip that one, go to the next one. So here we are at the river, and this is just illustrating the different types of trailer that we have. There's a winch on, winch off trailer. It can be operated by one person. And let's skip ahead. And this is a hover on, hover off trailer, which can be operated by one person. And by having reverse, you can back off. So here we are at the river and we're ready to start training. This is the most important part of the whole day, and everyone would prefer to spend the entire day on the river training, but it's extremely exhausting and also very expensive. So I try to limit it to about 2.5 to 3 hours. Expensive because hovercraft are quite dear to, as I said, they're like helicopters, so they cost a lot to run. So we have to limit how much time we can spend hovering. Now we're going to talk about hump, turning, ditching, plow in, side slipping, and reverse. Now, hump could actually be a subject that could consume the entire Zoom meeting. It's a very complicated process and very interesting one. And of course, in the early days, nobody really thought that it existed. It was a magic carpet and hovercraft just hovered. But when they're sitting over water and they're at slow speed, they have an Archimedean displacement. And you can see this where I took a photo, not this one, no, this one, up the river here. Yeah, this one. So this is showing what happens when we go up a little narrow channel in the hovercraft, and you can see the hump effect. It's exaggerated by the fact that this is a channel. But when the hovercraft's sitting in water, it displaces its own weight, makes a depression. And remember, the hovercraft was invented as a way of lifting the boat out of the water, which it does, but at low speed, it's exactly the same as a boat. And you have to accelerate such a rate that you can increase the speed and climb out of that depression. That's a function of many things, such as the length of the hovercraft. That's one of the most important things. Now you can see the hump weight being generated by the cushion, and as we continue to increase speed, we'll climb out over that, and then once we're above the surface, there is no depression or very small depression in the water. But it takes maximum power to exceed the hump speed. And it's quite a difficult phenomenon to train because we insist on picking a distant object in the river and aiming directly at it and taking off just as if this were an aircraft. And the reason we do that is to minimize the rudderage, because if the student is turning the rudder from left to right, every time they do that, they diminish thrust. And every pound of thrust is critical when you're trying to get over hump. So anyway, some of these wave patterns are very interesting. And it's quite easy to generate. And of course, out on a big lake, you don't see this, but it will generate a pressure field around the hovercraft. And one of the things that comes up with hovercraft is when it pushes the water down underneath, it hits the bottom. The water has to move according to Newton. The water doesn't want to do anything, but when it gets down, it has to be pushed out along the bottom of the water, and that puts a force back on the hovercraft. So hovercraft are more difficult to get over humping critical depth water. Of course, they're more difficult in fresh water than salt water, and if the water's moving, it changes the scenario, and if there's wind involved, and trim, and all of these other things affect getting over the hump. So we practice that by going upstream and changing the trim from neutral to nose down to nose up. And it's a lot easier to get over hump with the nose down, like a helicopter takes off, because you're getting a little bit of assistance from the cushion pressure. And when you get nose up trim, you get a lot of spray and you just sometimes cannot get over hump. And this is the technique of operating hovercraft, is to master hump and to stay away from it and to try and avoid falling under hump. So all of the things you do with the craft, the way you park it on the beach, the way you park it on the ramp, you have to always be thinking, what's the way to position the craft so when I take off, I can exceed the hump speed before I reach the water. So the next thing we practice is turning. So we drive up the river in a straight line, and this is an indication of what happens when you turn the rudder. If you're just going in a straight line and you turn the rudder, the craft will continue to operate in a straight line. So it's in terms of learning to fly hovercraft, it's probably the second most difficult thing to master. So now what we're going to do is, it's important that you set up obstacles or restrictions that you have to do the turning between the river banks or a couple of buoys or buoys. So this is when you're making the turn, the most important thing is that this little bow wave, the small wavelet on the front, that wave can never reach 90 degrees. It must always be less than 90 degrees, and you can watch that wave. And this is like setting up the attitude. Once you set the attitude up, which will be affected by the width of the river or the distance between the buoys, once you get that right, you can pretty much close your eyes and just continue to make a circle. So we put the student through that process, turn that into a figure 8, and then we reduce the size of it. But typically what happens is, as soon as the student starts to make the turn, at the very bottom part here where you see the small wavelets written there, the craft will go into a pirouette, what we call a corkscrew, and drop below hump. So it takes quite a long time for them to master this, of getting the balance of the trim and the RPM and so on, so that the craft does not drop below hump. Because when you're going sideways like that, you've changed the aspect ratio, and the craft's more like a circle when it's going sideways, so that means it's a lot closer to getting to the hump speed. Plus, there's nothing pushing the craft other than the component from the rudder and the momentum. So you have to balance all those things in order to stay above hump speed. So it's pretty tricky. Some people can get it, but other people can really spend a lot of time. We just continue doing this until the students convince us that they have mastered the technique. The next thing is ditching. I don't have an example of that, but ditching is something that can happen if the engine should stop, and you have to be prepared for it. A craft can ditch in any direction. Sideways is probably the more dangerous one, but I use the example of a duck landing. When a duck lands, they always put their feet out in front. So when you're going to ditch, very important to lift the nose and move back and get the nose up so that you mush in and you don't porpoise. Otherwise, you stop extremely quickly. Now, side slipping. Side slipping is a useful technique. This is what you see here for controlling the speed. And you've got to actually go perpendicular to the direction of travel. And it's very similar to skiers when they're coming down a hill doing a slalom, going from left to right. And you have to do the same thing with a hovercraft, go from left to right in order to not hit the riverbank. So by doing that, you can, when you're going sideways, you can bring the RPM all the way up and not increase the speed. Now, an interesting thing happens when you're doing this is, of course, the air is coming into the fan sideways. And when that happens, it'll load the fan in one direction and deload the fan in the other. Of course, if you have an extremely high torque engine, this is not so significant, but with a 2-cycle engine, their power curve is extremely spiky. And so you can find if you're turning to the right, depending on the fan rotational direction, if you're turning to the right, the craft will speed up. And when you're turning to the opposite, when you're turning to the left, it will speed up. When you're turning to the right, it will slow down. This is noticeable in racing hovercraft when they have to go around a buoy or a pylon. Then the next thing is plow in, and normally we don't cover that unless it's by accident. And we normally address covering it, plowing in at a next level of training. But to have a plow in, you need a tailwind and fairly smooth water, and all hovercraft plow in, just as all aircraft stall, and most aircraft don't stall because pilots are trained to avoid it, and you have to be trained to avoid plowing. That's one of the reasons we say keep the speed below 25 miles per hour. Then finally, reverse. Now, not too many hovercraft have reverse, but it's a very useful addition to the craft, and we train on it. We don't introduce the reverse until they've mastered the basics, and then we introduce the reverse. And this is like learning to fly by tapping yourself on the head, rubbing your stomach, and at the same time coordinating all these things. So you have to operate the reverse levers, the throttle, and the rudder simultaneously. So it's not something you pick up in the first day. It's something that takes some time to learn. But we use the reverse by hover. We go up the river, putting the reverse on to control speed. When we get under the bridge, come to a stop, and we do a pirouette left and right. And by turning, so putting on the right bucket, if you turn the right rudder, that will put more air into the bucket. So you can steer the hovercraft in reverse by using the rudder. You can do the same thing with the bucket, but when you do, you reduce your thrust when you're doing that. So it takes a little bit of coordination to get this, but when people get it, there's a big smile on their face. They really enjoy the advantages. And it does give you the ability to go backwards up to 25 miles an hour, and you can get into very tight spaces and don't have to worry about getting stuck. So now we're talking about when you're doing these maneuvers with the reverse, it's always best to try and do it with a tailwind, because the tailwind gives you a little more thrust and more time to figure out what's going on, but you really can't think, do I pull this bucket or I turn the rudder? You've just got to do it like you learn to balance on a bicycle. It has to be something natural. So when you're going backwards, of course, it's very important to look backwards, because sometimes there can be a surprise behind you. The spray that's generated by hovercraft can be controlled by the pilot, either by leaning or reducing throttle, or just by the way they operate. So if you take off into a wind sideways, you're likely to get the spray brought into the craft. If you take off into the wind, then the spray can go out to the side. So the pilot can manage to control the spray. Now, at this point, we return to after we've spent 2.5 to 3 hours on the river and making sure that the student has mastered, at least to the point where they're not going to have an accident, and mastered these various techniques. And then we come back to the factory, wash the hovercraft, and this is an extremely important process where we use hot water and soapy rags, and we go over the entire craft as a form of inspection, and we're looking for issues. So if we find a bolt on the floor, we don't pick it up and throw it out. We look for where it came from, and we make notes, and we can enter that information in the logbook. Now, at this point, it's lunchtime. So what would you like for lunch? Well, this is not going to cost very much because nobody wants lunch, it seems. Okay, next we do a factory tour. Now, it's a small factory, and we don't have mass production techniques because there's no mass market. So what we do is we manufacture using what we call cell manufacturing, and we do very little subcontracting. We try to make as much as we can in-house. And so we take them through the fiberglass shop, which is separate from the metal shop, mainly because of a concern about fire. And then the fiberglass shop does all the glass work. And then we bring the glass parts over to the assembly area. And we have 3 bays in which we put the parts, and we bring all the parts together. We have a software system that was developed in-house, and it was developed in the early stages of the internet, so it can be operated on the internet using PHP, and we totally rely on this system to manufacture our craft. Carries all of our parts inventories, our suppliers, and so on. So when we get an order, we generate a build sheet which has all of the information on the vendors and what we have in stock and how many of each we need, and all those parts are collected and brought into the assembly bay. The concept is you stay in the assembly bay and do the assembly, but of course, nothing works the way it should. People prefer a screwdriver in the next bay. They'll walk over and get that screwdriver. So we somewhat followed the Toyota concept that low technology before high technology. So we use a Kanban system of cards for picking parts. We started out using high tech, and we had virtual bins. What a nightmare. So we went away from that and came back to little cards, and everything is controlled with these cards. Kanban system. Now, we at this point, we start doing a complete review of the craft that we use for testing. So the craft's been brought in, and we'll go through the lift system, the thrust system, and skirt system, and all these things. There's an example here of a skirt system. Well, this is showing the different types of skirts. These are the segmented skirts, and you can see the little model, which is a bag skirt. I don't know if that you can run that.
Segmented skirt system, or finger skirts, which are these, and they're made up of 3 different types. There's an open type, then there's one for the front, which is an anti-plough skirt, and there's one for the back, which is an anti-scoop skirt. Then there's a bag type skirt, which is this type of skirt. It's like an inner tube, goes all the way around, and it just hovers. It sits on a piston of air. And then the third type of skirt is a dupe skirt, which you can see in the hover ball when we do the video of the hover ball. Gallagher hover. Put together in combination, so you can put segments on the bottom of a bag, you can put dupes on the bottom of a bag, and each one of these skirt systems has its advantages and disadvantages, and by putting them together you can find the happy advantage from each one.
So this is a hover ball that we developed. And what you can see here is this is using dupes, but I use this to demonstrate the rule that you cannot hover more than 1/10 the width of the craft. So if the craft is 10 foot wide, you can hover 1 foot. If you increase that ratio by more than 1/10, the craft becomes unstable. And that's what I'm demonstrating here. And you can look inside the duct and you can see the skirts inside moving. And that illustrates the fact that the air in the cushion's moving around. And that's what makes the craft unstable. As you bring the hover height down, you get the skirts closer to the surface and they become more stable. You can also demonstrate with that model the little daylight clearance underneath. Now, this was originally built as a billiard ball, so it had a top on it, and it was made for a comedian called Gallagher. So after we talk about that, we talk about the thrust system, and we have a thrust duct with stator blades, stationary blades, and we talk about the fan, the propeller, which is this device. These all work on the Bernoulli principle. We start off talking about the lift system and the Archimedean displacement. So it's Archimedes, there's Bernoulli theory, which controls the flow of air over the fan and inside the ducting and the hovercraft. And then we talk about Newton, who provides the thrust, the theory for the thrust. And the air going through the duct, with this device, when it spins around, actually causes the air to rotate. And if you can straighten the air out with stationary blades, then you've got a lot of advantages. You can improve the thrust, and you can change. You do not have to have very large rudder blades. You can have a small cascade of blades, and the reverse buckets work very well if the air's coming into the bucket straight. So stationary blades are very important. Next, we talk about the thrust. By the way, the maximum thrust on this craft is only 160 pounds, and 96 pounds is what we can get in reverse, and 48 pounds per bucket. And that's at 100% throttle. So the basic control are rudders, throttle, reverse, and weight shift. Then, of course, we talk about all those things in detail in the factory. And then we talk about cleats, because there are structural cleats on the hovercraft that are used for lifting and for towing. We talk about the mesh guard that goes over the fan. We talk about the fuel system, mixing fuel, because these are 2-cycle engines. We also explain it's extremely important to use a good funnel with a filter and demonstrate all of these things. Instruments, we go over those. calibration. The reverse bucket has to have a calibration system because sometimes things can happen, like bits of debris can get caught in the bucket and has to be recalibrated. And then we have a very accurate temperature gauge, aircraft temperature gauge, which we can use to monitor the engine and to get a readout after the training's finished. And everything is fused in the instrument panel. And then we get into maintenance, and that's a big subject in itself. Hovercraft are extremely high maintenance vehicles, and that is for many reasons. One, most hovercraft are driven by novices, and novices are very hard on equipment. The other thing is, if you want to make something reliable and dependable, you do what nature does. And I use a little example here, and you probably won't be able to see it, but this is a little seed, and nature makes this little seed in millions, like a helicopter rotor, and every time I drop it, it spins and works. And the process of selection that nature uses is what you use to develop a product. So if you can make a lot of products and stay in business a long time, the products will get better and the maintenance will come down. But right now, the market's very small and there are very few people producing hovercraft. Nobody makes anything for hovercraft. Everything that's inculcated in the hovercraft is developed for some other purpose. This is an industrial ventilating fan. The skirt material is used to make backpacks. Everything, the cables, the rudder cables are push-pull industrial cables. All these things are brought together and we have to make them work in this new environment, which is a very tough one. So hovercraft are directionally challenging to operate. They create an aerosol environment and you've got to make all this machinery run in that environment. So that means high maintenance. Plus, they do things that nothing else will do. So you can't compare them with an automobile. An automobile is very low maintenance because there are so many of them that have been produced, but they also operate on a very expensive track. And hovercraft does not have that track. So we're operating over rough terrain. It tends to wear out skirts and get them torn and so on. So they're very high maintenance devices. So therefore you have to, when you're using a hovercraft, you have to take that into account. Most people, of course, don't realize that until they become an owner. So we go over lubrication, belt adjustment, how to change the fan blades. We go through the electrical system, vibration, and what happens when an engine won't start. When an engine won't start, you have to have three things for a combustion engine. You have to have a spark, you have to have fuel, and you have to have compression. Any one of those things are missing, engine will not run. So you check the spark first, and when you take the plug out, you know how to check the spark. You can put your tongue on it, or you can hold it against your skin or whatever. That's one way. That's a very positive way to check it. The other way is, the next thing you check is compression. You hold your finger over the spark plug, turn the engine over, you should feel compression. And finally, fuel. That's a little bit more tricky to check. You take the air filter off and you can get some fuel in your hand if you want, throw it in the engine. And if it fires, that tells you it's not getting fuel. And these are basic things that you need to know when you're stuck up a creek somewhere and you have to get the craft started. And this can often happen in very adverse conditions, like -10 degrees. I've been stuck in a remote location and couldn't even tell if there was a spark. And I thought I could hear a spark, but in the end, I managed to get the craft to run I didn't have anything with me other than my hand, so I got fuel in my hand and threw it in the engine. So these are the three things you need to know for an engine to run. We go through removing the thrust duct, which can be done in 7 minutes, and that exposes the fan and the exhaust system. And then we talk about lubricating push-pull cables. The problem with push-pull cables in cold conditions is they freeze. And they're very difficult to, well, the craft won't operate when they're frozen. So they mean high maintenance each year. We've tried many, many solutions to this problem. And what we do now is we fill the cables each year with WD-40. We've tried glycerine and we've tried silicon and many other things, but we've found in the end that just filling up with pumping WD-40 through the cables work well. Then we get into part failures. We talk about belts, instruments, the electrical system that the fan shafts that break, the sprockets that wear out, we cover those things. And then after we've done all, there is a session there where we cover the electrical system. And these electrical systems on two-cycle engines can be very problematical. Cause you to pull your hair out, really. And then we then move from there to the classroom and spend 1 to 2 hours of classroom time, where we go through the whole thing again, covering the theory behind the Archimedean pump drag. We talk about ploughing, we talk about ditching, we talk about turning and side slipping and reverse, covering all those things. There may be a photo on the 10 if you can find it. And then, okay, you haven't got it there. Go to the end. So keep going. So when we do the classroom and we end up with a comprehensive test, which the student has to pass. It's a simple yes/no test, but it covers all sorts of things like what's the fuel mixture ratio and what's the maximum number of passengers you've got to carry, how fast you should go, and all of those things. And then we do, then we hand it over to the student to do a course review. And we have a little sheet we give out and they fill in some information on that. We find that very useful. At the end, we present a certificate. You can see some students here receiving a certificate. And we put this photograph up on hovercrafttraining.com. So you can see if you go on there, students from all over the world. And sometimes the students can be, we can have multiple students. Those classes are extremely difficult to train. At training, really, in 10 hours or 11 hours of training is totally insufficient. We really need about a week to do it properly. And when you're training something like this is the Suffolk County Police Department on Long Island, they want you to train them in a day. Well, it's just not possible. About all you can do is give them a joyride. So on the certificate, it says that this is the Hovercraft. That's the name of our hovercraft pilot certificate. The name of the person that's received has successfully completed the Neoteric hover pilot operation and maintenance class 3 training, class 3, because we have other stages of training. And we have a course number 16780. And then this is thereby certifies that him or her has learned to pilot and maintain the Hovercraft. And then it's signed by the instructor or instructors, and their address is on the bottom. And that's the end of the course. So do you have any questions? I'm sorry about the mix-up with the video and stuff, but we're pretty new at this business.
Thank you very much, Chris. Most of the people have got their themselves muted at the moment, so if you want to start talking, please unmute. I'd like to start the discussion with a question about your training of these larger groups. Basically, is how do you tackle it? Because obviously, the kind of most of what you've described, an individual is experiencing. So how do you approach the training of a group?
Well, we do it exactly the same way as we do with individuals. We have to take them one-on-one, one at a time, and that leads to a lot of boredom because they have to stand around and watch. We do have a system. We use these wireless headsets that are voice activated, so they have a 2-mile range. So we can have the students on the bank, and they can listen in, and they can learn quite a bit from hearing the training going on the water. So that's the process we use. If we have multiple instructors, and there are not very many people around that can instruct, that we have available that can instruct, so there's a dearth of instructors. So if I have a big group, I try to get an additional instructor to help. Otherwise, it's extremely fatiguing. At the end of the day, I'm totally wrung out. It's about all I can do to make it home.
Okay, perhaps we could switch to hoverwork and hover travel. Ben or Andy, how do you approach your training on the larger craft?
I think in broad terms, it is a fairly similar structure in that you start with the absolute basics. And the key things about getting the craft over hump and how getting the message across about how to make the craft turn is really critical. And so we use the three golden rules, which is the yaw, speed, and trim. And if the student can remember those three things when they're operating, that tends to keep the craft operating quite well. And well, we tend to try and run a basic training course in about a week for the larger craft, around about 25 hours to get through the real basic bits. I think it's actually quite interesting what Chris said as well about certain people having a feel for it or not. Some people have quite a natural feel for it quite straight away. Some people take a bit longer and they do it a bit more by numbers, but they get there. And then sometimes you get people that just don't get it. I think, and that can be quite difficult in how to manage that. I think sometimes I'd actually be interested to know, Chris, what your rough pass rate is.
Well, the issue is that the training's usually associated with the purchase of a hovercraft. So there's a lot of stress, pressure on there to make sure that the student passes. So I wouldn't say we have a very high standard there, but sometimes when the student's extremely bad, we'll modify the certificate. We won't say they passed, we'll change the wording. And that's how we get around that problem. They don't actually end up with a class 3, they just end up with an abbreviated training session, of course. But it is a big issue, and really it should be done the same way as aircraft training. You have to pass a test and you have to convince an instructor. You know, they're much more rigorous, but we're not big enough for that, and we don't have the market, a big enough market to force that on us, but that will come in time.
Okay, could I pass over to Mr. Nunemaker, because I'd be interested how you follow up in your service. Hi, Mr. Nunemaker in the middle here from the fire service. Yeah, you're still muted, I'm afraid.
I'm sorry, respond.
Oh, there you are. Yeah. No, it's just what Chris is.
Sorry, we just had a residential fire pop off here, so I had to get sidetracked on the radio traffic. What was the question?
Well, Chris has gone through the rather focused initial training. So the question is, how about follow-up?
Follow-up. So we do our training in-house. I attended Chris's training several years ago and had probably 10 years of experience on Chris's Neoteric hovercrafts in both the maintenance and the training as well. We find it's very specific to each student and their how comfortable they are, with kind of any off-road vehicle, motorcycles, ATVs, that kind of stuff. But we've had a pretty good success rate. I do a lot of the maintenance, well, all of the maintenance and the glass work and stuff. So it's very important to me that people don't get rushed through because it will take one of our craft out for months on end. We have 2 of them. So fortunately, we're able to use one as a training craft and then one is our live craft that we use for rescue, or both. But it's really nice to have the second because training can be very problematic. Our rivers are very small. We've had a lot of issues with fuel systems, so we've kind of made some modifications to work better in our environment. We have a lot of just very small rivers, blackberries, that kind of stuff that are all over the place, and a lot of debris that we deal with. So we've made some modifications. But yeah, the training is definitely key to ours, because an inexperienced pilot will take a hovercraft out almost immediately. So we try to base it very much, not so much a time, but more practical skills. So we like to make sure we have a 25 or so practical skills that we've mimicked with Chris's training, that we make sure people can do before we send them out. So a time frame for us really doesn't mean too much. It's a lot of practical skill based, because we found you can send somebody out for 5, 6, 20 hours and they still really know nothing. So we actually force them into environments, very safe environments that we've kind of staged, in order to actually demonstrate the proficiency of certain skills. I think we have a lot of large rocks. So when Chris mentions the helicopter like flying, that we're very much in that, because we've taken out several halls, because people fly them like an airplane and they want to land them on the rocks, instead of coming up and then airing down vertically. So we're I think 12, 13 years into this, using hovercraft. It is definitely the most effective tool for our rivers. In the summertime, we have very low rivers, lots of sandbanks. In the wintertime, we have floods almost 3 to 4 times a year. So we've used jet boats, and those tend to plug and foul and stuff with all the debris in the floodwater. So the hovercraft is very useful for us. There's definitely nothing we found that works in our area as well. So, but yes, they're maintenance intensive for sure.
Okay. And then Ben or Andy, what about the regular follow-up? I realise for a pilot for a 12,000, it's a different environment but what about the follow-up for those pilots?
Well, generally we follow up every sort of 2 years with a refresher to revalidate their type rating. So where we can, obviously we get back with the customer and revalidate them. That's generally what we do.
All right. Okay. And
one of the bigger challenges we can find is trying to convince operators that the training is worthwhile. A lot of people obviously have a lot of marine or maritime experience, and trying to explain that the hovercraft is different to a boat, that can be a challenge to get the message across. But we always find that the operators that invest in the training and take the time to take the training seriously, they have the better operation. They care more about the maintenance of the craft, and look after it better, and they operate it more safely, and they have less incidents. It proves itself.
And Alan, we do have students that come back for refresher courses, and sometimes the fire service or police service will send people back for a next level class where we get involved in long distance traveling in nighttime operations and high speed plowing, those types of things. So we do have a few students that will come back and do those courses as well. So but it would be a good idea if people came back for refresher courses, because sometimes they can pick up bad habits and you can sort that out when they come back.
Yeah. Okay. If I could come in again, either, or perhaps both Nick and John, take John first. You mentioned that as we were just starting, John, that you updated the regulations with the MCA. How about the pilot training in those regulations and how to apply those?
That's a good question. The regulations say that if it's depending on the size of craft, it does say that the person has to, if it's a big craft, has to have a type rating certificate. So that is, and under the MCA regulations, that in the UK, that type rating certificate can be given by the manufacturer. so it is in the hand of the manufacturer of the craft to produce a program and assess the operator, and has to do a certain number of operating hours prior to being carrying passengers. So that they are covered in the MCA hovercraft regulation, but it doesn't detail the training. It just says that the operator has to have those certifications before they can operate the craft.
Yeah, and maybe there's a little bit of a gap there to fill in eventually. How about with the HCC then, Nick? How does it work there? Nicholas?
Are you wanting to talk to me?
I was, yes.
Fine. This is the first Zoom meeting I've had in 75 years, so you must bear with me just a tiny bit. What was the question again, please?
Oh, please don't worry, Nick. Well, after Chris's explanation of how he initially trains people and the program that they go through, how is assessing people's driving ability with the craft such as you have within the Hovercraft Cruising Club dealt with?
Basically, we've got a system that where we can assess people and train them. Pickup has been patchy at best, but so it's on a one-to-one basis. That's perhaps the best description. My difficulty is, having been hovercrafting for 65 years now, I learned when I was so young, I had no idea what I was doing, but it becomes so automatic when you're young. And then when you know it's how to operate something automatically, then you have to really think hard about how to get that across to people. It's on a one-to-one basis. And that's the way we do it. We've tried more structured teaching, but our cruising club is a small part of the hovercraft scene in UK. And as such, if anyone asked me, I would be more than willing to help. But it's on an ask basis. If no one asks me, I am not going to be able to help them. I would love to work for Neoteric, possibly for nothing, just to enjoy teaching people, but living in UK and the commute is just not really on.
Bit of a long way, I guess. Yes.
Long way, yes. Right, thanks.
But, yeah, and Chris, I was just asking about a couple of the other kind of organisations over here. I guess the HCA probably have recommendations, but sorry, the Hover Club of America I'm referring to. I wonder, do they have any program that they go through, or is it again a bit like
No.
Nick has just said?
No, they're not very well organised at all. In fact, they're in need of real leadership, I think. But and whatever regulations and whatnot they'll pick up, they'll adopt the European ones or UK or wherever they can get them from. But there are no US regulations, and there's no specific requirements for training.
Okay.
Any of these.
Yeah.
Okay. And we're not really heavily involved in racing, so it's nothing like the British Hover Club. I wish it was, but it isn't.
No. Okay. Well, we'll try and follow up with a bit on a presentation on racing training a little bit later, perhaps in the year or early next year. It's one of my plans. But yeah, if anybody else has a question, please ask. Otherwise, yeah, sure. I think we'll move to closing. We have Mike Mooney has a question, first of all.
Yeah, sure. It's comments as well as a question. Nick, you were saying right at the start and referred to it a couple of times that basic hovercraft training was based on similarities between helicopters. When I was taught to drive the SRN6s, the engine on that craft was exactly the same as the Wessex 5 helicopter. A lot of our controls were very similar. The other thing with the hours of training, the training program was for 50 hours. At the end of that 50 hours, you got your certificates or whatever. In the services, we didn't get a certificate, you just passed. Having said that, the one thing that always accepted and expected and happened was at the end of the 50 hours or 49, 51, you always had your accident. You didn't get it at 25, 20. You always had a crunch about the 50 hours. Continuation training was done when you went to your unit. So you continued training even though you're still qualified. How would that affect? That was just accurate, the controls of the craft. We did the seamanship, the navigation, rules of the road, meteorology and everything else, radios, everything else was different and at different locations. The total time normally was about a year to train a military hovercraft pilot, a lot less than the week that you're sort of doing. How would this configure with the situation you've got? Because you're training pilots up on your smaller craft, which we used to enjoy driving, but with the military craft and bigger craft like Ben's driving and stuff like that, it's a different ball game altogether.
Well, I've always realized that the military could get a big advantage from using like small hovercraft for training.
Absolutely.
But I've never been able to persuade them to take a look at it, because the cost of operating these big hovercraft is probably in excess of $1 million an hour. So they could buy quite a few of these small craft and operate them for 1 hour and throw them away and be well ahead. But of course, the military doesn't work on any sort of consideration about costs. So it can't be approached from that angle. But I've not succeeded. I really think there could be great advantages in training on small hovercraft. And of course, Griffin Hoverwork probably can't afford to train for a year unless it could get a military contract.
Yeah.
And that's what I would like, a military contract, because that would give us the resources to do the whole thing properly.
Yeah, we actually found, although we operated the larger craft in several different types, we gained a lot of advantage by actually driving the smaller craft because of weight distribution, trim and stuff like that. It's something you automatically do with instruments and levers on a large craft. You've got to do it with body weight on a small craft. And it's a completely different concept altogether. And that is where we got a lot of our experience from, for doing the different things we did.
It was actually something we tried with an operator last year, where we used a small hovercraft just to do their very basic introduction to driving a craft before they moved on to something much bigger. I think in that instance, it gave them some quite useful background to getting those real basic principles of how hovercraft works before moving on to the bigger craft. But it does depend on the contract and the types of craft available for use when we're doing the training.
Interesting what you say, Ben. Those pilots that came over for training, were they straight mariners, or what was their background really?
Yeah, that they had worked on conventional ships. One chap came from large tugboats, and the other chap from coastal vessels. And in fact, Andy spent a week with them on the small 380 TD before they transferred over onto the 12,000s.
Yeah. It worked extremely well as an aptitude test as well, to see who had the ability to actually pick this up and run with it, and the ones that couldn't quite get it. So it works really well in that way.
And that's where it'd be a big advantage to the military, because they waste a lot of money training people who once they get a large amount of money invested in the training, they just say, oh, I don't want to do this anymore, or they can't do it. So that's one aspect of it. The other thing, I got the opportunity to drive an LCAC, but before I went out and drove it, they put me in a simulator. And these simulators are very expensive, but I had a heck of a time driving the simulator. I really couldn't do it at all. I was just overreacting all the time. So there is talk, and I'm often asked, what about getting a simulator to cut down the cost of the training? And nobody's developed a small simulator, and I don't know if you're thinking about that at Griffin or not.
It's something we have looked at doing a simulator, but speaking personally, it's just not the same. You don't get that feel, and for particularly smaller, I think for all sizes of hovercraft, you still need to have that feel about how the craft's reacting or responding to the control inputs you're putting in. The simulator is certainly useful for some aspects, but it doesn't beat the real thing.
Okay, all right.
Just to say, Nick, that when I was being trained, I was in the army at the time, but I was trained at the Inter-Service Hovercraft Unit in Leon Solent. The instructor was an RAF squadron leader. We had Army, Navy and Air Force instructors training you on different aspects of what your training was supposed to be. And the very first thing they said, they sat us in a classroom and said, the first thing you need to understand about a hovercraft is it doesn't necessarily go in the way that your ship is pointing. So you might be going sideways, you're pointing north, you're heading east and things like that. And that was the first things they introduced us to. Things are going to be different.
Very good indeed.
There's a joke about that. It was a Japanese test team in the Arctic, and Mr. Yamamoto was driving the craft, and the team asked him, where are you going, Mr. Yamamoto, where are you going in the hovercraft today? And he said, well, you'll have to ask the hovercraft.
Yeah. We always considered that we're on a 50-50 basis. The hovercraft had 50% of its control, you had 50%. If you can gain anything more than that, you're a winner. But you're always fighting not only the elements, but the craft itself, its capabilities and stuff like that. And it's something you're always doing, and albeit automatically, but you're always doing it.
Well, that brings up an interesting point that I missed, that I meant to mention, and that is that we do training on water because water is flat.
Yeah.
And land is not. And we have we sold a few hovercraft for golf courses. They're not really practical on golf courses, but they're extremely exciting to operate, but you've got no idea where the craft's going to go. You can't have any sort of predetermined idea what it's going to do. So training on water gets rid of the gravitational effect, and hovercraft can detect a 0.5 degree of slope. So, and the gravitational force of a 0.5 degree on the weight of the vehicle is significant, and it's usually more than the thrust force. So when you get on land, you have to have a lot of a skill to be able to anticipate the kinetic energy in the craft and the slopes that you're going to be dealing with when you're crossing, say, frozen tundra or something like that. It's completely different than operating on water.
That's right. One of the things we had to do, I mean, on our engine log, all we logged was the engine running hours. That was it. Now, in a particular event in Denmark, I was on an exercise. It took us 2 hours to get from the base to the location where we were going to be. We stayed 7 days on a 24-hour monitoring system, radar, radios and stuff like that, and reporting everything that went. When we got back, it was another pause. We had 4 hours operating on a 120-hour sortie. They are never in my logbook anywhere, those other bits. So we'd go out and do something, but we'd probably sit for days monitoring activities of whatever's going on. Only the navigator got that information in his logbook. So my 1,500 hours is only engine operating, not the 10,000 plus hours I did on the monitoring. That doesn't show anywhere. That's the way the military works. And when we did our training, we had to do night training and operating at night as well as day, because most of our operations were at night anyway in clandestine.
Yeah,
So
perhaps
that's another thing that
Sorry,
happens.
Chris.
We get into training on ice and in snow, and that is a completely different business. And also training in swift water, and we don't have very much swift water close to our factory here, but we have a low head dam in the northern part of Indiana, which we go for swift water training, and that brings up a whole slew of new issues. And there are a lot of low head dams in the US, and they're extremely dangerous. And when the water comes over the low head dam, it aerates the water. So when you're hovering close to the dam, you don't hover as high because the Archimedean, the density of the water is significantly less. So there are many issues that come up in operating in those different environments. And of course, none of that can be covered in the first day of training.
Absolutely. On the Hovercraft web now, I think Alan's put it under YouTube. We've got where we were operating in Norway in snow and on ice. We used to do all that in Norway. We used to have 6 weeks in September and 3 months, January, February, and March in Norway doing exercises out there with Marines, anybody that was about. But again, we operated on the ice and in the snow. As I say, I think, Alan, that is available to members to be able to watch that video that's got the Hovercraft in uniform. It shows operating on ice in Norway.
That's true, yeah.
So it is available, Nick, if you want to watch it.
Right. Okay. I think it's time that we should really call this to a close. We've gone a little over the hour which we planned, but with a lot of interesting discussion. And Chris, thank you very much indeed for taking the time, clearly a lot of time to prepare, including the videos that you included. And of course, we just mentioned one other area which we ought to try to cover some of the time on ice and snow operations. But for now, thank you very much indeed, and on behalf of the Society, and we look forward to seeing as many of you as possible at another presentation in the future, a little bit later in the summer. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank
you, Chris. Thank you, Alan. Thank you, Chris.
Wish you all a very good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
All right.
Okay.
Thank you. Cheerio.
Bye for now.
Bye.
Thank you.